They say true talent shows itself in the darkest moments, and young Daniel Harrison was about to prove why even the most hardened outlaws should fear a boy raised on gunpowder and grit. This is the story of how a ruthless gang learned too late that they'd threatened the wrong rancher's son, a quiet young man whose steady hands masked a gift that could only be measured in bullet holes and brass. Before we dive deeper into this tale, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've got something extra special coming your way. As the merciless summer sun climbed high over Thunder Valley Ranch, casting harsh shadows across the weathered fence posts and sun-bleached buildings, Daniel Harrison sat motionless on the front porch of his father's house, methodically cleaning a revolver that had seen better days. His calloused hands, unusual for a 17-year-old, moved with practiced precision over each part, every motion, betraying an intimacy with firearms that went far beyond mere familiarity. The worn Colt 45 had been his father's once, back when the name Thomas Harrison could fill exhibition halls across 3 states. Old Jim Mackenzie, who'd worked the ranch since before Daniel was born, often said the boy had been born with a 6-shooter in his hand instead of a silver spoon. Those who knew the Harrison family understood there was more truth to that statement than most realized. Thomas Harrison, Daniel's father, had been a legend in his own right, a champion shooter whose exhibitions had once drawn crowds from as far as St. Louis and Denver. But that was before the accident, before the drink, before he'd retreated into himself, leaving his son to shoulder burdens no young man should have to bear. The ranch hands avoided the porch when Daniel was cleaning his guns, which had become a daily ritual since the Black Hawk gang had started making trouble in Thunder Valley. They'd already burned 2 neighboring ranches, their owners mysteriously disappearing after refusing to sell their land to the railroad interests moving into the territory. But what unsettled the hands most wasn't Daniel's dedication to maintaining his firearms. It was the way he would sometimes pause in his work, raise his hands as if holding an invisible gun, and track the movement of birds across the sky with those unnaturally steady fingers. His eyes calculating distances that would make even seasoned marksmen hesitate. Sarah Connor, who ran the general store in nearby Silver Creek, still talked about the day she'd seen young Daniel out hunting. She'd been gathering herbs on the ridge above Cottonwood Creek when she spotted him tracking a deer. The shot he made was impossible, or should have been. The buck was running full tilt, nearly half a mile out, when Daniel's rifle cracked once. The deer dropped so clean, so precise, it was as if lightning had struck it from above. Sarah never mentioned what she saw to anyone but her husband, and when the Black Hawk gang started their campaign of terror through the valley, she found herself watching the quiet Harrison boy with new eyes. None of the ranch hands had ever seen him shoot. Not really. There were rumors, of course, whispered stories about impossible shots made while hunting, about bottles shattered at distances that strained belief. But Daniel never participated in the hands' shooting contests, never rose to their good-natured and taunts about proving himself. He just kept to his daily routine, splitting his time between ranch work and caring for his father, those quiet hands never far from a holster. The late morning sun had baked the porch boards to a temperature that would scorch bare feet, but Daniel hadn't moved for over an hour. His father was having one of his better days, actually coming down for breakfast and managing to hold a conversation about the ranch's declining cattle prices. These moments of clarity were becoming rarer, and Daniel treasured each one, even when they brought painful reminders of the man his father used to be. This morning, Thomas had even mentioned the old days, speaking of trick shots and exhibition tours, with a spark of his former enthusiasm. "Your mother," he'd said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held his coffee cup. "She always said you had my eyes when you were born. But it wasn't just the color, boy. It was the way you looked at things, like you were measuring every distance, calculating every angle." He'd fallen silent then, lost in memories of his late wife. But the words had stirred something in Daniel, a recognition of a truth he'd always known, but never fully acknowledged. The sound of approaching horses drew Daniel's attention from his work. Through the heat-rippled air, he could make out 3 riders approaching the ranch at a leisurely pace, their intentions written in the way they carried themselves. The lead rider sat his horse like a man who preferred intimidation to conversation, his black duster catching the hot wind. Behind him, his companions spread out slightly, a classic gunfighter's approach that spoke of experience and ill intent. The Black Hawk gang had finally decided to pay the Harrisons a visit, unaware they were about to learn why some talents are best left undiscovered. Daniel's hands never paused in their methodical cleaning of the Colt, but his eyes, those shooter's eyes his father had mentioned, had already noted distances, angles, and the subtle way the wind bent the tall grass near the corral. In the back of his mind, he could hear his father's voice from years ago before the accident. "Son, it's not about being the fastest or the meanest. It's about seeing what others can't, about understanding the dance before the music starts." As the riders drew closer, Daniel reassembled the Colt with a speed and precision that would have made a gunsmith jealous. Every piece clicked into place, with the certainty of destiny, each sound a note in a symphony that was about to reach its crescendo. The Black Hawk gang was about to discover that some legacies don't die, they just wait for the right moment to reveal themselves. Sheriff Marcus Wade sat in his office in Silver Creek, studying the wanted posters that had been piling up on his desk with growing concern. The Black Hawk gang's reputation had spread like wildfire across 3 territories, leaving a trail of burned homesteads and broken families in their wake. Marcus had known Thomas Harrison in the old days, before the accident that shattered more than just his shooting arm. He'd watched young Daniel grow up, noticed things that others missed, the way the boy's eyes tracked movement, how his hands always seemed to know exactly where they needed to be. "More coffee, Sheriff?" Martha Chen, the owner of the Silver Dragon Cafe across the street, stood in his doorway with a steaming pot. Her family had run the restaurant for 2 generations, weathering the prejudices of frontier life through a combination of exceptional cooking and quiet resilience. "You look like you haven't slept." "Thanks, Martha." Marcus pushed his cup toward her. "Just thinking about the Harrison boy. Saw him in town yesterday, buying ammunition at Sarah's store. Something about him reminded me of his father back before—" He trailed off, remembering the exhibition where it had all gone wrong. "Tragic business," Martha nodded, filling his cup. "But that boy's got steel in his spine. Comes in every Sunday after church, orders the same meal his father used to. Always. Exact change, always a kind word." She hesitated. "Though lately I've noticed something different about him, the way he sits, always facing the door, always aware, like he's expecting trouble." Marcus had noticed too. The whole valley had changed since the Black Hawk gang arrived, bringing with them promises of progress, wrapped in threats of violence. The railroad was coming, they said, and those who didn't sell would burn. But the Harrisons' spread was different. It sat on the only viable pass through the mountain ridge, making it the key to controlling the entire valley. Old Jim Mackenzie chose that moment to burst through the office door, his weathered face flushed with urgency. "Sheriff, riders headed for Harrison's place, Blake Thompson himself leading them." Marcus felt his blood run cold. Blake, Black Devil Thompson, was the Black Hawk gang's enforcer, a man who'd earned his nickname through deeds that decent folks wouldn't discuss in daylight. If he was personally calling on the Harrison ranch, how many? Marcus was already strapping on his gun belt. "3 that I saw." Jim's voice carried the weight of worry. "But Sheriff, it's not Thompson I'm worried about. It's Daniel." "The boy?" Martha's eyes widened. "Surely they wouldn't—" "No," Jim cut her off. "It's what might happen to them. There's something you both need to know about Daniel Harrison. Something I saw last month that I haven't told another soul." Marcus paused in checking his ammunition. He'd known Jim Mackenzie for 20 years, knew him as a man who measured his words carefully. It was dawn, and I was checking the north pasture. "Defense," Jim began, his voice low. "Saw Daniel up on Harper's Ridge, practicing with his father's old revolvers. Sheriff, I've watched exhibition shooters from San Francisco to St. Louis, but I've never—" He shook his head. 6 bottles, thrown in the air at once. 6 shots, so fast they sounded like one. Every bottle destroyed before a single piece hit the ground. Single piece. Martha crossed herself, a habit left over from her Catholic schooling. Mary, Mother of Mercy. "That's not all," Jim continued. "When he was done, he just stood there, reloading like he was in no hurry at all. Then he looked right at where I was hiding. Must have known I was there the whole time. Just nodded once and walked away. Never mentioned it, never showed off like that again." Marcus absorbed this information, pieces falling into place. The way Thomas Harrison had been so insistent on teaching his son before the accident. The quiet way Daniel carried himself. The slight bulge under his coat that wasn't quite hidden enough to be a concealed weapon, but wasn't meant to be. "Jim," Marcus asked carefully, "you're sure about what you saw?" "Sheriff," Jim's voice was heavy with certainty, "I've been around guns my whole life. What that boy can do, it ain't natural, and if Thompson pushes him—" He left the thought. Unfinished, Marcus made his decision. "Martha, send word to Deputy Collins. Have him ready the horses. Jim, you're with me." He checked his watch, an old habit from his days as a territorial marshal. "With luck, we can get there before—" A single gunshot echoed across the valley, sharp and clear in the morning air, then another, and another, and another. The 3 of them stood frozen, counting the reports that rolled across the landscape like thunder. When they stopped, Martha spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. Heaven help them. "No," Marcus said grimly, heading for the door. "Heaven help anyone who pushed Daniel Harrison into proving he's his father's son." The 3 riders pulled up 30 yards from the porch, their horses' hooves kicking up dust that danced in the morning light. Blake Thompson sat astride his black stallion like a dark prophecy, his duster catching the wind as he surveyed the weathered ranch house. The man's reputation had been built on violence, but it was his eyes that told the true story, cold and calculating, like a rattler sizing up its prey. "This the Harrison place?" Thompson's voice carried across the yard, though he knew damn well whose land he was on. His 2 companions, hard-looking men with matching gun rigs, spread out slightly, their hands hovering near their holsters. Daniel didn't move from his spot on the porch, his father's restored Colt resting casually in his lap. Inside the house, he could hear his father stirring, likely drawn by the sound of visitors. "You know it is, Mr. Thompson." A flicker of surprise crossed Thompson's face at being recognized, followed by a cruel smile. "Well now, seems my reputation precedes me. That'll make this conversation shorter." He shifted in his saddle, deliberately letting his duster fall back to reveal the paired Remingtons at his hips. "Got a business proposition for your daddy. Why don't you run inside and fetch him?" "My father's indisposed." Daniel's voice remained steady, his eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. The way Thompson's right gun belt was worn slightly, lower than his left, how the man on the right favored his left leg, probably from an old injury. The nervous energy in the 3rd rider's trigger finger tapping against his saddle horn. "But I speak for the ranch now." A laugh rippled through Thompson's men, but their leader's expression darkened. "Boy, this ain't the kind of conversation children should be having. Railroads coming through this pass, whether your daddy likes it or not. We're here to offer fair compensation before things get complicated." As if to emphasize Thompson's words, the rider with the nervous trigger finger drew his rifle from its scabbard, letting it rest casually across his saddle. The movement was meant to intimidate, but Daniel had already calculated the man's draw, speed, factoring in the awkward angle and the morning sun that would be in his eyes. "This land's not for sale." Daniel's words carried the weight of finality. Never has been, never will be. My father built this ranch with his own hands, and I aim to keep it in the family. Thompson's smile vanished like morning dew under a harsh sun. Maybe you didn't hear about what happened to the Jensen place last week, or the Murphy spread the week before that. Terrible accidents, fire taking everything. No survivors to tell the tale. Inside the house, Daniel heard his father's bed creak, followed by the familiar sound of the old man's unsteady footsteps. His time was running out. He needed to end this before his father walked into danger. I heard. Daniel's hand remained relaxed on the Colt. Also heard about 3 riders who didn't make it back from the Murphy place. Bodies never found, but their horses turned up in Cedar Creek, saddles empty and clean as Sunday morning. The temperature seemed to drop, despite the morning heat. Thompson's men exchanged glances, but their leader's face had gone still as stone. Those missing riders hadn't been mentioned in any official reports, and the story had been kept quiet. To avoid panic, the fact that this boy knew about it. That a threat, son? Thompson's voice had lost its fake friendliness, replaced by something cold and deadly. No, sir. Just telling stories. Daniel's eyes never left Thompson's face, though he was acutely aware of the other men's positions, the angles between them, the way the wind would affect any shots beyond 20 yards. Like the story about how my father used to be the finest exhibition shooter west of the Mississippi. Could hit a dime at 50 paces, they say, put 6 bullets through the same hole at 25 yards. Used to be is right, Thompson sneered. Everyone knows Thomas Harrison's nothing but a broken-down drunk now, after that accident ruined his shooting arm. Shame about that exhibition in Denver. Heard he hasn't touched a gun since. Daniel's finger twitched almost imperceptibly at the mention of Denver, but his voice remained calm. Thing about talents like that, Mr. Thompson, sometimes they run in the family. The significance of his words didn't register immediately, but when it did, Thompson's face twisted with understanding. His right hand dropped toward his gun, fast as a striking snake, but Daniel was already moving. The Colt seemed to materialize in his hand, as if conjured by magic rather than drawn. His first shot took Thompson's hat off, the second knocked the rifle from his nervous companion's hands, and the third disarmed the man with the limp. All 3 shots came so fast they sounded like a single report echoing across the yard. Thompson froze, his gun barely cleared of leather, as Daniel's 4th shot put a neat hole through his duster, right between the 2nd and 3rd button. Warning so precise it could only have been intentional. That's 4, Daniel said quietly, the Colt unwavering. I've got 2 more, and my father always said to save something for encore. The morning breeze carried the smell of gun smoke across the yard, mixing with the dust kicked up by the horses. Thompson's men sat rigid in their saddles, their eyes wide with the realization that they'd walked into something they didn't understand. They said Harrison's boy was simple, Thompson spoke through clenched teeth, his hand still hovering near, his half-drawn gun. Said you barely talked, never caused trouble. Don't much like trouble, Daniel agreed. Don't much like showing off either. But I like threats to my family even less. His eyes hardened. Now, way I see it, you've got 2 choices. Ride out of here, tell your railroad friends this land's not for sale, and we all get to enjoy this beautiful morning. Or, he left the alternative unspoken, but his meaning was clear. Thompson's face worked through a series of emotions: rage, fear, calculation, and finally a grudging respect. You think this is over, boy? Thompson slowly moved his hand away from his gun. One lucky showing don't make you a gunfighter. Men are going to hear about this, going to want to test themselves against Harrison's prodigy son, and some of them won't be as patient as me. Maybe so. Daniel's aim didn't waver. But you won't be one of them, will you, Mr. Thompson? Because you've seen what I can do when I'm being polite. Might not want to find out what happens if someone pushes me into being rude. The sound of approaching horses came from the direction. of town. Sheriff Wade and his posse, no doubt, though they were too late to matter now. Thompson recognized the sound too, his expression turning calculating. "Mount up," he ordered his men, turning his horse with exaggerated care. Boys made his choice. Railroad can find another route. But as he guided his stallion around, he fixed Daniel with a look that promised this wasn't over. "Impressive show, son. Real impressive. But remember, every target eventually runs out of luck." Daniel watched them ride away, the Colt still ready in his hand. Only when they disappeared into the heat haze did he finally lower the weapon, his hands shaking slightly as the tension bled out of him. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. "Daniel?" His father's voice was clearer than it had been in months. "I heard shots. Just some salesmen, Pa." Daniel carefully holstered the Colt. "They weren't buying what we were selling." Thomas Harrison stood in the doorway, his damaged arm held close to his chest, but his eyes were sharp with understanding. "6 shots," he said quietly. "Fast as lightning, clean as morning dew. Just like I taught you. Just like you taught me," Daniel agreed, turning to face his father. For a moment they looked at each other, the broken champion and his prodigy son, and something passed between them that needed no words. The approaching riders were closer now, their hoofbeats mixing with the sound of the wind through the grass. Daniel knew this was just the beginning. Thompson was right. Word would spread, challenges would come. The quiet life he'd built was over, shattered like a bottle under a perfect shot. But looking at his father, seeing the pride and worry warring in the old man's eyes, Daniel knew he'd make the same choice again. Some talents couldn't stay hidden forever, and some legacies were worth the price they demanded. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows on the porch as father and son waited for the sheriff to arrive. In the distance, dust rose from Thompson's retreat, carrying with it the last traces of Daniel's anonymity. The boy who'd hidden his gift was gone, replaced by something both more and less than what he'd been. The legend of the Harrison name was about to be reborn, one perfect shot at a time. Sheriff Marcus Wade arrived at the Harrison ranch to find Daniel and his father sitting on the porch like it was any other morning, though the gun smoke hanging in the air told a different story. 4 brass cartridges lay in the dust of the yard, each one placed with surgical precision where they'd fallen. It was the kind of detail that spoke volumes to a man who knew what to look for. "Quite a show you put on," Marcus said, dismounting. Alongside Jim Mackenzie, words already spreading in town. Martha Chen's place is buzzing with talk about how Harrison's boy outgunned Blake Thompson himself. Daniel remained seated, his father's Colt still within easy reach. "Wasn't trying to put on a show, Sheriff." "No," Marcus agreed, studying the young man carefully. "That's what makes it more impressive. Thompson's got a reputation as one of the fastest guns in 3 territories. Yet here you sit, calm as Sunday morning, after sending him running with his tail between his legs." Thomas Harrison stirred in his chair, his damaged arm twitching slightly. "My boy was just protecting what's ours, Marcus. Nothing more to it than that." But there was more to it, much more, and everyone on that porch knew it. Jim Mackenzie walked the yard, examining the scene with practiced eyes. He stopped at each spent cartridge, noting their placement, reconstructing the sequence of shots in his mind. "Sheriff!" Jim called out, his voice tight with amazement. "You need to see this!" He pointed to the series of shots, tracing their trajectory. First shot took Thompson's hat, second and third disarmed his men, and the fourth— He shook his head in disbelief. The 4th shot went through Thompson's coat without touching him. "That's not just shooting, that's something else entirely." Marcus had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. In all his years wearing a badge, he'd never seen shooting like that. Not even Thomas in his prime had shown such precision, such absolute control. "Daniel," Marcus spoke carefully, "I think it's time we had a real conversation about what's really happening in Thunder Valley. Thompson and his railroad friends, they're just the surface of something much deeper." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" Marcus glanced at Thomas, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Your father knows some of this from before. His accident. The railroad's just a cover. The real prize is what's under Thunder Valley, gold and lots of it, the kind of wealth that makes men forget their souls. That's why they want the pass, Daniel said softly, pieces falling into place. Control the pass, control access to the valley. Exactly. Marcus pulled out a worn letter from his vest pocket. Got this from the territorial marshal last week. Thompson's working for more than just railroad interests. There's a man named Victor Drake behind it all, a businessman from back east with connections all the way to Washington. He's been buying up land across 3 territories, using the railroad as a front. Thomas Harrison's hands gripped his chair's armrests, his knuckles white. Drake! He spat the name like poison. Should have known he'd be behind this. Daniel turned to his father, surprise flickering across his face. Pa? Victor Drake was in Denver that day, Thomas said, his voice heavy with old pain. The day of the accident. He'd made an offer on the ranch the week before. Offered enough money to set us up for life. When I refused, he trailed off, lost in memories. The accident wasn't an accident, Marcus finished quietly. We could never prove it, but someone had tampered with Thomas's guns. The timing was too perfect, the stakes too high. Daniel absorbed this information, his face unreadable, but Marcus, watching closely, saw something change in the young man's eyes. A hardening, a focus, like a rifle being sighted in on a distant target. Drake's men have been moving systematically through the valley, Marcus continued. The Jensen and Murphy places were just the start. They're clearing out anyone who might resist when they make their big move. And your ranch, sitting right at the pass, is the key to everything, Daniel finished. That's why Thompson came himself, why they sent their best. Jim Mackenzie had returned to the porch, his weathered face grim. And now that you've shown your hand, boy, they'll come at you harder. Drake's not a man who takes defeat lightly. Good. Daniel's voice was soft but carried an edge that made everyone on the porch go still. Because I've got some questions about Denver that need answering. Thomas reached out with his good hand, gripping his son's arm. Daniel, no. These men, what they did to me was just business to them. But if you go after Drake... They made it personal, Pa. Daniel cut him off gently. The moment they decided our land was worth more than your life, they made it very personal indeed. Marcus watched the interplay between father and son, seeing the weight of destiny settling on young shoulders. But there was something else that worried him, something about the way Daniel had handled Thompson and his men. Your shooting, Marcus said carefully. It wasn't just good, it was perfect. Too perfect. The kind of shooting that makes men nervous, makes them wonder what else you can do. Daniel met his gaze steadily. What are you asking, Sheriff? I'm asking if you're ready for what comes next. Word of this morning's show will spread like wildfire. Every gunfighter and glory seeker between here and the Mississippi will want to test themselves against Harrison's Prodigy son. And Drake, he'll send worse than Thompson next time. Let them come. Daniel's hand rested on the Colt, his fingers tracing patterns worn smooth by years of practice. Pa taught me more than just shooting. He taught me about responsibility, about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. And I taught you too well, perhaps, Thomas said softly. Taught you things I promised your mother you'd never need to know. A heavy silence fell over the porch, broken only by the wind through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Marcus studied the young man before him, seeing not just Thomas Harrison's son, but something more, a force of nature wrapped in human form, as dangerous and precise as a summer lightning strike. There's more, Marcus finally said. The territorial marshal's letter mentions something else. Drake's not just after gold. He's building an empire out here, using men like Thompson to create chaos so he can step in with his own brand of order. The kind of order that comes with strings attached and blood on the ground, Daniel nodded slowly. And now I've become a complication in his plans. More than that, Jim interjected. You've become a symbol. The ranch hands were talking about it before I rode out, about how Harrison's boys stood up to Thompson's gang. People are starting to hope again, starting to believe they can resist. Hope's dangerous, Marcus warned. Drake will want to crush it quick, make an example. He can try. Daniel's voice was quiet but carried the certainty of a well-aimed bullet. But Pa also taught me that some things are worth fighting for. This land, this valley, the people who call it home, they're worth more than Drake's gold or his empire dreams. Thomas Harrison struggled to his feet, his damaged arm trembling with the effort. Then we'll fight them together, son. These old bones might not be what they were, but I've still got some fight left in me. Marcus saw the emotion flash across Daniel's face. Pride, love, and something fiercer, like a wolf protecting its pack. The simple confrontation with Thompson had evolved into something far larger, a battle for the soul of Thunder Valley itself. I'll send word to the territorial marshal, Marcus decided. Let him know what's really happening here, but Daniel... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Whatever happens next, remember, a gun can be a tool or a curse. Your father learned that the hard way in Denver. I remember everything about Denver, Daniel said, his voice carrying an edge that made even Jim Mackenzie step back. Every detail, every shadow, every face in the crowd that day. And soon, Victor Drake's going to remember it too. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the last traces of gun smoke from the yard. But as Marcus mounted up to ride back to town, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real smoke, the kind that came with war and reckoning, was just beginning to rise over Thunder Valley. The news of Daniel Harrison's confrontation with Blake Thompson spread through Thunder Valley like a prairie fire. By sunset, Martha Chen's cafe had become an unofficial gathering place for those seeking details of the morning's events. The story grew with each telling. 6 shots had become 10, then 15, each version more spectacular than the last. But those who knew the truth understood that the reality was far more impressive than any embellishment. Sarah Connor stood behind her store counter, watching Daniel through the front window as he picked up supplies. The young man moved differently now, she noticed. The careful way he'd always carried himself had transformed into something more deliberate, more aware. Every rancher and cowhand in the store gave him a wide berth, their conversations dropping to whispers as he passed. Quite a change from yesterday, old Pete Miller observed, settling his bulk against Sarah's counter. The retired stage driver had seen his share of gunfighters in his day. Boys carrying a heavy burden now. Fame's a dangerous thing in these parts, especially with Drake's men watching, Sarah replied quietly, nodding toward 2 strangers lounging outside the saloon across the street. They'd arrived an hour after word of Thompson's humiliation had reached town, their city clothes and careful, a posture marking them as more than simple travelers. Daniel finished his shopping, loading supplies into his saddlebags with methodical precision. As he worked, a small figure darted from between the buildings, young Tommy Jensen, whose family's ranch had burned just last week. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, but his eyes held the hard look of someone who'd seen too much. "Mr. Harrison," Tommy called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Is it true what they're saying? Did you really outshoot Blake Thompson?" Daniel paused in his work, studying the boy carefully. "Shouldn't believe everything you hear, Tommy." "But you did stand up to them," Tommy pressed. "You showed them they can't just take whatever they want." The boy's hands were clenched into fists, his whole body trembling with barely contained rage and grief. Sarah watched as something shifted in Daniel's expression, a softening around the eyes, though his voice remained steady. "I'm sorry about..." Your family's ranch, Tommy, about your pa. They said it was an accident, Tommy spat, said the fire just happened. But I saw them, Mr. Harrison, saw Thompson's men riding away that night. Pa tried to fight them, but—" His voice broke. Daniel knelt down to the boy's level, his movement drawing worried glances from the strangers across the street. "Sometimes standing up isn't about being the fastest gun," he said quietly. "It's about knowing when to fight and when to wait. Your pa was a brave man, Tommy. Don't let anyone tell you different." "Will you teach me?" Tommy blurted out. "To shoot like you." "Oh, do. I want to make them pay for what they did." A heavy silence fell over the street. Sarah held her breath, seeing the weight of the moment settle on Daniel's shoulders. His response would ripple through the community, setting a tone for what was to come. "Revenge is a poison, Tommy," Daniel finally said, his voice carrying clearly, in the hushed street. "It burns you up inside, leaves nothing but ashes." He stood slowly, his hand resting briefly on the boy's shoulder. "But justice, that's something worth waiting for, something worth doing right." The distinction wasn't lost on those listening. Sarah saw heads nodding, saw the way people stood a little straighter. Daniel wasn't just refusing to train a child for revenge. He was teaching a lesson about the difference between vengeance and justice that the whole town needed to hear. As if to punctuate the moment, horses approached from the north end of town, a group of riders led by none other than Frank Carter, owner of the largest spread north of Thunder Valley. Carter was known as a hard man, but a fair one, and his word carried weight with ranchers across 3 territories. "Harrison," Carter called out, reining in his horse. "Got a moment to talk business?" Daniel finished securing his saddlebags, his movements unhurried. "Always time for business, Mr. Carter." "Heard about this morning," Carter said, dismounting, with the grace of a man half his age. "Heard how you handled Thompson and his boys. Got me thinking about a proposition." The strangers across the street had straightened, their casual poses forgotten as they strained to hear the conversation. Sarah noticed Daniel had positioned himself so he could watch them in the reflection of her store window, a subtle move that spoke volumes about his situational awareness. "Drake's been pushing all of us," Carter continued, his voice pitched low but carrying enough for those nearby to hear. "Buying some out, burning others out. But if we stood together, if we formed an association of ranchers, presented a united front—" "They'd just bring in more men," Daniel observed quietly. "More guns, more fire." "Unless we had something they couldn't ignore," Carter's eyes glinted. "Like proof of what really happened in Denver. Proof that Drake's empire is built on murder and fraud." Daniel's hand had drifted to his father's Colt, though the movement seemed more reflexive than intentional. "What kind of proof?" "Got a friend in Denver," Carter said. "Former marshal who investigated your father's accident. Says he found things that didn't add up, things that were buried before they could come to light. He's willing to talk, but only in person, only to Thomas Harrison's son." The implications hung in the air like gun smoke. This wasn't just about protecting one ranch anymore. It was about exposing a conspiracy that stretched back years. The strangers across the street had given up any pretense of casualness, openly watching the exchange. "When?" Daniel asked simply. 3 days, Carter replied. "In Promise City. My men will help watch your spread while you're gone." He paused, studying the young man carefully. "This is bigger than Thompson's threats or Drake's gold, son. This is about something that's been rotting in the territory for years. Question is, are you ready to pull it up by the roots?" Daniel's response was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Wade, riding hard from the direction of the telegraph office. The look on his face told its own story. Something had happened, something that would change the game yet again. "Daniel!" Marcus called out, his voice tight with urgency. "Wire just came in from the territorial marshal. Drake himself is coming. Left Denver 2 days ago with a train of hired guns, and he's bringing someone with him, someone who knew your father." The street had gone deadly quiet. every ear straining to catch the sheriff's next words. Daniel stood motionless, his face unreadable, but Sarah saw his trigger finger tap once against his holster, a tell she'd noticed whenever he was processing something significant. "Who?" Daniel's voice was soft, but carried clearly in the silence. "Marcus," swallowed hard. "Jack Lightning McGrath, the man who shot against your father in that exhibition, the one who was supposed to lose, but didn't." The name fell like a stone in still water, sending ripples of whispers through the gathered crowd. McGrath was a legend in his own right, a shooter whose speed was matched only by his ruthlessness. If he was coming with Drake... 3 days, Daniel said, turning back to Carter. "I'll be in Promise City, but first I need to have a conversation with my father about Jack McGrath and the truth about what really happened in Denver." The storm that had been brewing over Thunder Valley was about to break, and everyone present knew that when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The evening sun cast long shadows across the Harrison Ranch as Daniel found his father in the old practice yard behind the barn. Thomas Harrison stood before the worn targets he'd set up years ago, his damaged arm held close to his chest, his good hand tracing the weathered posts as if reading a story written in the bullet-scarred wood. "You should have told me about McGrath," Daniel said quietly, stopping a few paces behind his father. Thomas didn't turn around. "Some stories are better left buried, son. Some ghosts should stay in their graves." "Not these ghosts, Pa. Not anymore." Daniel moved closer, noting how his father's shoulders tensed at the name he hadn't spoken yet. "Jack Lightning McGrath is riding with Drake. They'll be here in less than a week." The change in Thomas was immediate and disturbing. The former champion shooter spun around with surprising speed, his face pale, his good hand trembling. No, that's not possible. McGrath disappeared after Denver. Nobody's seen him in years." Sheriff Wade got the wire himself. "McGrath's coming, and I need to know what really happened that day. All of it." Thomas stumbled to a nearby bench, suddenly, looking every one of his years and then some. The setting sun painted harsh lines across his face as he struggled with memories he'd tried to drown in whiskey for years. "It was supposed to be simple," he finally began, his voice barely above a whisper. "A standard exhibition match. McGrath was Drake's man, had been for years, though nobody knew it then. The plan was for him to make a good showing but lose gracefully. Drake would use the publicity to promote his new venture capital firm, and I'd get enough money to expand the ranch." Daniel settled onto the bench beside his father, watching the play of emotions across the older man's face. "But something went wrong." "Something wrong?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "Everything went wrong. The day before the exhibition, Drake came to me with a new proposal, said he'd bought up most of the valley already, showed me papers to prove it. Wanted our ranch too, said it was the key to everything, offered enough money to set us up for life. But you refused. This land was your grandfather's dream, son. He died making it work, and I swore I'd never sell. Drake, he didn't take rejection well, said I'd regret choosing dirt over dollars." Thomas's good hand clenched into a fist. Next day at the exhibition, McGrath wasn't playing to lose. He was playing for keeps. Daniel remembered that day in fragments. The roar of the crowd, the glint of sun on guns, the sudden horror as his father's shots went wild. "They tampered with your guns." Not just tampered. McGrath had loaded them himself, said it was part of the show, that we'd both use the same ammunition for fairness. I was a fool, so focused on the performance that I didn't check them properly. Thomas closed his eyes, lost in the memory. First shot felt wrong. Second shot blew the gun apart in my hands. The pain. I thought I died right there in front of all those people. And McGrath played it perfectly, rushed to help, acted devastated that his friendly competition had ended in tragedy. Drake's doctors were right there, whisking me away before anyone could ask too many questions. By the time I realized what had really happened, the evidence was gone, and McGrath had vanished. Daniel absorbed this information, pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. That's why you taught me to always load my own ammunition. Why you made me learn to spot tampered cartridges. Taught you everything I could, Thomas nodded. Every trick, every technique, every lesson I'd learned the hard way. Prayed you'd never need them. But I knew someday Drake would come, back to finish what he started. A noise from the house drew their attention. Jim Mackenzie approaching with a lantern, his face grave in the gathering dusk. "Ryder's coming," he announced without preamble. "Thompson's back and he's not alone." Daniel stood, his hand dropping instinctively to his father's Colt. "How many?" "Dozen, maybe more. Moving slow, taking their time." Jim's eyes shifted to Thomas. "They're led by a man in a white hat, riding a pale horse." Thomas Harrison went even paler. "McGrath, he's early." "No," Daniel's voice was iron. "That's not McGrath. Thompson's trying to rattle us, using what he's learned about Denver, testing our nerve." His father struggled to his feet. "Son, if it is McGrath..." "It's not." Daniel's certainty was absolute. McGrath's with Drake, and Drake's the kind of man who makes an entrance. When they come, it'll be with an army at their backs, not a dozen riders in the dark. Jim nodded approvingly. "Boy's right, Thomas. This is Thompson trying to press his advantage while he can. Word's spreading about how your son handled him this morning. Man like that, his reputation's all he has. He'll want revenge before Drake arrives to take over." The sound of hooves grew clearer, accompanied by the jingle of tack and the low murmur of men who thought themselves predators. Daniel did a quick mental calculation. 12 riders meant 72 potential shots if they all carried 6 shooters. The yard offered cover, but the approaching night would make accuracy a challenge. "Jim," Daniel said quietly, "get my father inside. Bar the doors, stay away from the windows." He checked his ammunition automatically, though he knew exactly how many rounds he carried. "And send word to Sheriff Wade if you can. Tell him Thompson's chosen his side." Daniel, no. Thomas gripped his son's arm with surprising strength. "You can't face them alone, not in the dark, not like this." But Daniel was already moving, his steps sure and deliberate as he headed for the front of the house. "Pa," he called back softly. "Remember what you taught me about night shooting? About how to use the muzzle flash to spot targets? Every target eventually runs out of luck," Thomas quoted himself from years ago, his voice breaking. "But a true marksman makes his own luck." "I won't be alone," Daniel assured him, pausing at the corner of the barn. "I've got years of your lessons watching over me. And Thompson's about to learn that some things are better left in the dark." The riders were closer now, their approach deliberate and menacing. In the last light of day, Daniel could make out the white hat of their leader, pristine and proud atop a pale horse, a deliberate mockery of the man who had nearly killed his father years ago. A slight smile touched Daniel's lips as he moved into position. Thompson thought he was being clever, using the Denver story to create fear. But he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd given Daniel something he'd been seeking for years. A chance to rewrite the story of that exhibition day, to show the world that the Harrison name still stood for something. The night wind carried the sound of Thompson's voice, calling out a challenge that was equal parts bravado and desperation. But Daniel had stopped listening. His world had narrowed to distances and angles, to the weight of his father's gun in his hand, and the lessons written in bullet-scarred wood behind the barn. The ghost of Denver was about to be laid to rest. One shot at a time. The night had turned the practice yard into a maze of shadows, each deeper than the last. Thompson's riders spread out in a loose semicircle at the edge of the Harrison property, their horses nervous in the growing dark. The white hat gleamed like a beacon, its wearer clearly wanting to be seen. "Come on out, boy." Thompson's voice, carried across the yard, heavy with false bravado. "Time to finish what we started this morning." Daniel stood motionless in the shadow of the barn, watching, waiting. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Patience is a shooter's best friend. Let them make the first mistake." He could hear Jim Mackenzie barricading the house behind him, could feel his father's presence at an upstairs window, despite his instructions to stay back. "You really think that hat makes you McGrath?" Daniel called back, his voice pitched to Gary. "Man like that wouldn't need 12 guns at his back to face one boy." A murmur ran through Thompson's men. The white hat shifted as its wearer stiffened. "Awful confident for someone outgunned 10-1, Thompson snarled. "McGrath's just a story. This is business." "No." Daniel's voice had grown colder. "This stopped being business when you tried using Denver to scare us, when you made it personal." He stepped away from the barn, letting the last light catch him. "But since you want to play at being McGrath, let's make it interesting. You and me, Thompson, 1 shot each, just like the exhibition," more muttering from the gathered riders. Thompson's reputation was on the line. He couldn't back down from a direct challenge, not with his men watching, but Daniel had offered him something dangerous, a chance to prove himself against Harrison's Prodigy son. 1 shot? Thompson's laugh was harsh in the gathering dark. "Boy, I'm going to need just 1 shot to finish you." "Then prove it." Daniel took another step forward. "Or take off that hat and admit you're not half the gunman you pretend to be." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Daniel counted heartbeats, measuring the distance, noting how Thompson's men had unconsciously shifted to give their leader room. Pride was about to make Thompson do exactly what Daniel needed him to do. "Fine." Thompson dismounted with elaborate care. 1 shot each. "But when I win, your father signs over the ranch tonight. And when you lose," Daniel's voice carried the certainty of a bullet's trajectory, "you ride out of Thunder Valley and never come back. You or your men." Thompson's hand dropped to his gun. "Deal. On 3. On 3. The count seemed to take forever, each number hanging in the air like smoke. 1. Daniel's world narrowed to essential details. The subtle shift of Thompson's weight, the way his gun hand twitched slightly. 2. The white hat gleamed in the last light. A perfect target. Thompson's men leaned forward in their saddles, eager to witness history that Thompson drew before the last word left his mouth, exactly as Daniel had known he would. The shot rang out, loud in the confined space of the yard. But Daniel was no longer where he had been, his father's training, taking over as he moved like flowing water. His own shot came a heartbeat later, deliberate and precise. The white hat flew from Thompson's head, a neat hole drilled through its crown. Before it hit the ground, Daniel had fired twice more, his father's Colt seeming to leap from its holster of its own accord. Thompson's gun went spinning away, along, with any illusion that he could match McGrath's legend. "That's 3 shots, Mr. Thompson," Daniel said quietly into the stunned silence. "1 to match your cheat, 1 to disarm you, and 1 to remind you that I could have killed you at any point." He tilted his head slightly. "Would you like to see what I can do with the other 3 bullets? Thompson stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and growing fear. But movement from his men shattered the moment, several reaching for their guns despite the odds they'd just witnessed. What followed would be talked about in Thunder Valley for years to come. Daniel moved with impossible speed and precision, his shots coming so fast they seemed to overlap. Guns flew from hands, hats leaped from heads, and in one spectacular display, a rider's reins were shot cleanly through, leaving him clutching his saddle horn as his horse backed away in panic. When the echo of gunfire faded, not a single man among Thompson's crew remained armed. The ground was littered with dropped weapons, yet not a drop of blood had been spilled. 11 shots, Daniel announced into the ringing silence. 1 left in the chamber. Someone want to try for an even dozen? No one moved. Even Thompson seemed rooted to the spot, his previous bravado replaced by the sickening realization that he'd badly underestimated what he was facing. "The boy's not natural," one of the riders muttered, crossing himself. "Devil's work shooting, like that in the dark. Not the devil," Thomas Harrison's voice carried from the house, strong and clear for the first time in years. "Just my son. Now get off our land before he decides to start aiming for something besides hats and hardware." The retreat was nearly comical in its haste. Riders scrambled for their dropped weapons, none willing to be the last one in the yard. Thompson mounted his horse with shaking hands, his face visible in the emerging moonlight, all color drained from it, leaving him looking like a ghost of his former self. "This isn't over," he managed, though his voice lacked conviction. "Drake's coming, McGrath's coming, they'll find me waiting." Daniel cut him off. "And Thompson, leave the hat. White's not your color." As the riders disappeared into the night, Daniel finally allowed himself to feel the tension drain from his shoulders. The confrontation had gone exactly as he'd planned, a display of skill, dramatic enough to spread word far and wide, but without the bloodshed that would have brought immediate retaliation. Jim Mackenzie emerged from the house, lantern held high. "Sweet Jesus, boy, I counted 11 shots, but could have sworn I heard only 6. Speed's not about how fast you pull the trigger," Daniel quoted his father's lessons. "It's about making time work for you instead of against you." Thomas Harrison made his way down to the yard, his steps steadier than they'd been in years. He knelt painfully, picking up the fallen white hat, examining the perfect hole Daniel's shot had created. "You knew," he said softly. "Knew Thompson would try to use McGrath's reputation, knew his pride would make him accept the challenge." Daniel nodded. "And knew his men would need a demonstration they couldn't ignore. By morning, every ranch in the territory will hear about this. They'll know Thompson isn't invincible." "They'll know more than that," Jim said grimly. "They'll know the Harrison name still means something, that there's someone standing against Drake and his empire." He paused, looking at Daniel with new respect. "But son, you've just painted a mighty big target on your back." "Good." Daniel holstered his father's Colt with fluid grace. "Because I'm counting on Drake hearing about this, counting on him understanding exactly what's waiting for him in Thunder Valley." He turned to his father. "And counting on McGrath, wanting one last shot at a Harrison." Thomas studied his son in the lantern light, seeing not just the boy he'd trained, but the man he'd become. "You're using Thompson to send a message." "Several messages," Daniel corrected. "To Drake, to the Valley, but mostly to McGrath. He needs to know that what happened in Denver won't happen again, that this time a Harrison is ready for him." The night wind carried the distant sound of Thompson's retreat, along with the promise of storms to come. But for now, in the bullet-marked yard of his father's ranch, Daniel Harrison stood unchanged by his display of prowess. The quiet son of a fallen champion had shown his hand, revealing a talent that would draw killers like moths to a flame. The real battle for Thunder Valley was about to begin. Dawn painted Thunder Valley in shades of gold and promise, but the peaceful scene belied the tension humming through the air. Word of Daniel's night shooting had spread faster than wildfire, drawing riders from every corner of the territory. By mid-morning, the Harrison Ranch had become an unlikely gathering place for those who'd suffered under Drake's expansion. Frank Carter sat his horse at the head of 20 riders, each representing a different ranch or homestead. Sarah Connor's wagon was parked near the barn, loaded with ammunition and supplies. Even Martha Chen had closed her cafe to bring food for what was rapidly becoming an impromptu war council. 36 hours, Sheriff Wade announced to the assembled crowd. "That's how long until Drake's train arrives. My deputy in Promise City counted 50 hired guns at last report, with more joining at every stop." Daniel stood on the porch watching. The gathered faces, these weren't gunfighters or glory seekers. They were ranchers, farmers, shopkeepers, people who'd built lives in Thunder Valley only to see them threatened by Drake's ambitions. "And McGrath?" someone called out. "Is he really with them?" "He is." Thomas Harrison emerged from the house, standing straighter than he had in years. The events of the previous night seemed to have awakened something in him. "Jack McGrath's no myth, folks. What he can do with a gun, it's not natural. There's a reason Drake kept him in reserve all these years. Then why bring him out now?" Carter asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. "Because of me," Daniel said quietly. "Because what happened last night with Thompson showed Drake he needs more than just hired guns to take Thunder Valley." His hand rested on his father's Colt. "He needs to break the Valley's spirit, and what better way than to have McGrath finish what he started in Denver?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Everyone knew the story now, how Thomas Harrison's exhibition shooting had ended in tragedy, how Drake's manipulation had nearly destroyed a legend. But now they also knew it hadn't been an accident. "That's why we're here," Frank Carter spoke, up his voice carrying authority earned through years of fair dealing, not just to fight Drake's men, but to stand against everything they represent, the buying, the burning, the breaking of good people's spirits. He turned to Daniel. "Last night, you showed us it could be done. Showed us that one person standing up makes it possible for others to stand too. And if we don't," Sarah Connor called out, "if we back down—" Sheriff Wade stepped forward, holding up a telegram. "Got this from the territorial marshal this morning. Drake's not just buying land. He's buying judges, politicians, anyone who can help him legitimize what he's stolen. If we don't stop him here in Thunder Valley, there won't be anywhere left to run." Daniel absorbed this information, his mind working through angles and trajectories just as his father had taught him. Only now he was calculating more than just bullet paths. "We can't match them gun for gun," he said finally, "even with everyone. Here we're outnumbered, but we have something they don't." He gestured to the gathered crowd. "We have home ground. We know every ridge, every wash, every place where a man might find advantage or ambush." Old Jim McKenzie stepped forward, spreading a map across a makeshift table. "Boy's right. Drake's men will have to come through the pass. It's the only way. To bring that many riders into the valley, we can use that." The next hour was spent in detailed planning. Riders were dispatched to strategic positions, supplies distributed, communications arranged. Daniel watched it all with quiet intensity, noting how his father's expression grew more focused with each passing minute. "Still thinking about Denver?" he asked softly when they had a moment alone. Thomas nodded, his damaged hand flexing unconsciously. "McGrath won't fall for simple tricks. Man's got a mind like a steel trap and hands faster than summer lightning. He'll be expecting everything we've planned." "Good." Daniel's voice held the same certainty it had shown during the night shooting. "Because while Drake thinks McGrath is his secret weapon, he's actually his weakness." "How do you figure that?" "You taught me that every shooter has a pattern, Pa, even the best ones. They fall into habits they don't even recognize." Daniel's eyes took on a distant look, as if seeing something others couldn't. "I've studied every story about McGrath, every account of his shootings. And last night, with Thompson trying to imitate him, it all came together. Understanding dawned on Thomas's face. You weren't just showing off last night. You were practicing. Practicing for McGrath," Daniel confirmed. "Every shot, every move, designed to look like natural talent. Drake's men will tell him about it, and McGrath will think he knows what he's facing. Another prodigy, another gifted shooter who relies on speed and instinct." "But that's not you at all, is it, son?" Daniel's smile was slight but genuine. "You taught me better than that, Pa. taught me that true shooting isn't about talent. It's about preparation, about understanding angles and trajectories, about knowing exactly where every bullet will go before you pull the trigger. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more riders, the Jensen family from the North Valley, the Wilsons from the East Range, even old Pete Miller with his ancient buffalo gun that he swore could shoot the whiskers off a cat at half a mile. Sarah Connor approached, her face grave. "Just got word from my cousin in Promise City. Drake's hired guns aren't just criminals and drifters. He's brought in professionals, men with reputations almost as dark as McGrath's." "Let them come," Daniel said quietly. "Each man they bring is another set of footsteps to track, another gun to predict, another pattern to read." "You sound mighty confident for someone facing an army," Frank Carter observed, having overheard the exchange. "Not confidence, Mr. Carter. Certainty." Daniel turned to face the gathered crowd. "Every person here has something worth fighting for. Land, family, a future free from men like Drake. That's worth more than any amount of hired loyalty." The afternoon wore on as more riders arrived, each bringing news or supplies or simply their presence as a statement of defiance. The Harrison Ranch had become more than just a gathering point. It was becoming a symbol of resistance against Drake's empire. As the sun began to set, Daniel stood at the same spot where he'd faced Thompson the night before. The yard still held brass cartridges from that confrontation, each one a reminder of what was possible when skill met preparation. "You know," Thomas said, joining his son, "there's something Drake and McGrath never understood about that day in Denver." "What's that, Pa?" "They thought breaking my arm, ruining my reputation, they thought that would be the end of the Harrison name in shooting." Thomas placed his good hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Instead, it just meant I had to teach you everything I knew in a way that went beyond simple shooting. Had to make you understand the science of it, the mathematics of angles and trajectories. Had to make you better than I ever was." The sound of more approaching horses drifted from the valley below, more allies arriving as word of the coming confrontation spread. Daniel checked his father's Colt automatically, each movement precise and practiced. "Drake's bringing an army," he said quietly, "thinking numbers and reputation will win the day. But you taught me something else, Pa, something McGrath never learned." "And what's that, son?" "That a bullet doesn't care about reputation. It only cares about physics. And physics—" Daniel's smile held the certainty of mathematics, of trajectories calculated to the inch. "Physics never lies." The morning sun rose blood-red over Thunder Valley, painting the gathered defenders in crimson light. Daniel Harrison stood at his father's side, watching dust clouds approach from the pass, Drake's army coming to claim what they thought was already theirs. The valley had never seemed so quiet, as if the very land was holding its breath. "Rider, coming!" The call came from one of Carter's men posted on the ridge. "Single horseman, white flag." Through his father's old spyglass, Daniel could make out the approaching figure, a man in black riding a pale horse. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking Jack McGrath's legendary presence. "He's playing to the crowd," Thomas observed, grimly, "making sure everyone sees him come in peaceful-like just as he did in Denver." Daniel closed the spyglass with a snap. "History doesn't have to repeat itself, Pa." McGrath reined in 50 yards from the ranch house, his pale horse standing, eerily still in the morning light. The legendary gunman looked exactly as the stories described, lean as a desert wolf, with eyes that seemed to measure every angle of death. "Thomas Harrison!" McGrath's voice carried easily across the yard. "Been a long time since Denver." "Not long enough, Jack." Thomas stepped forward, his damaged arm held close. "Still doing Drake's dirty work, I see." McGrath's laugh was genuine, if cold. "Business is business, old friend. Speaking of which—" His eyes found Daniel. "This must be the boy I've been hearing so much about, the one who made Thompson look like a fool, Mr. McGrath." Daniel's voice was steady, revealing nothing. "You've caused quite a stir, son. Drake's offering terms, generous ones. The ranch plus 50,000 in cash, more money than 3 generations of Harrisons could earn honest." McGrath's smile didn't reach his eyes. "All you have to do is walk away. And if we refuse," McGrath's gesture encompassed the valley, "look around, boy. I've got 50 professional gun hands waiting in that pass. Men who've made their living killing better shooters than you. This isn't some night show with Thompson and his boys. This is real." "Like Denver was real?" Daniel's question cut like a razor. The change in McGrath was subtle but immediate, a tightening around the eyes, a slight shift in posture. "You don't want to push that particular stone, boy. Some things are better left buried." "Like the truth about my father's guns? About how Drake arranged the whole thing?" Daniel took a step forward. "Or about how a man of your reputation agreed to play butcher for a land-grabbing coward?" McGrath's hand dropped to his gun, then stopped as he caught himself. "Careful, boy. You're talking about things you don't understand." "I understand plenty," Daniel's voice carried across the yard, meant for all the witnesses gathering at the edges of the confrontation. "Understand how Drake's been poisoning this territory for years, using men like you to do his killing. Understand how many families have suffered because good men looked the other way. Then you understand this is bigger than you." McGrath's voice hardened. "Drake owns judges, politicians, territorial governors. You really think one boy with a fast gun can change that? Not alone." Daniel gestured to the gathered ranchers and townspeople. "But I'm not alone, am I? Every person here has something worth fighting for, something worth dying for." His eyes locked with McGrath's. "What are you dying for, Jack? Drake's money, his promises." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. McGrath studied Daniel with the calculating eyes of a professional killer, measuring angles and probabilities. "You're good, boy. Maybe even as good as they say, but this isn't about skill." He straightened in his saddle. "Last chance. Take the money, or I start earning mine." Daniel's response was quiet, but carried clearly in the morning air. "How about a third option, you and me, right here. 1 shot each, just like you and Pa in Denver. Only this time, with honest guns and witnesses." A murmur ran through the watching crowd. McGrath's reputation was legendary. No one had ever seen him lose a fair fight. But something in Daniel's stance, in the quiet certainty of his challenge, made even the hardened gunman pause. "Drake won't allow it," McGrath said finally. "He wants this ended clean, with witnesses to how his men brought law and order to a troubled valley." "Drake's not here," Daniel countered. "But you are. And every gunman in that pass is watching. They'll follow Drake's money, sure, but they respect reputation more than gold. If you back down from a fair challenge—" He left the implications hanging. McGrath's face worked through complex calculations. "You've thought this through, haven't you? Forced my hand in front of witnesses, made it about reputation instead of business." A ghost of genuine respect crossed his features. "Your father taught you more than just shooting. He taught me that every man has a choice." Daniel's hand rested near his father's Colt. "Even hired killers like you." The morning wind carried dust from the pass, along with the weight of watching eyes. Drake's men, the valley's defenders, all waiting to see what would happen next. McGrath sat motionless for a long moment, then slowly dismounted. "1 shot each," he said finally, "at my signal." His eyes narrowed. "But boy, if you're thinking of playing hero with a trick shot like you did with Thompson—" "No tricks." Daniel moved to position himself, seeing his father's worried expression from the corner of his eye. "Just physics." McGrath's legendary speed lived up to its reputation. His draw was like lightning, the shot cracking across the yard before most observers had even registered movement. But Daniel had been ready, had calculated this moment down to the smallest detail. His own shot came a fraction of a second later, perfectly placed, When the gun smoke cleared, McGrath stood motionless, his gun hand empty. His pristine black hat lay in the dust, a neat hole drilled through its crown, exactly like Thompson's the night before. But there was a difference. McGrath's bullet, aimed perfectly for Daniel's heart, had somehow been deflected. A brass cartridge lay in the dust between them, split cleanly in half by Daniel's shot. "Impossible," McGrath breathed. "No one can hit a bullet in flight." "Not impossible," Daniel corrected quietly. "Just mathematics. Trajectory, velocity, angle of deflection, all predictable if you know how to read them." His gun remained ready. "You're fast, Mr. McGrath, maybe the fastest ever, but speed isn't everything." Understanding dawned in the legendary gunman's eyes. "You knew exactly where I'd aim, knew the path my bullet would take. Because you have patterns, just like everyone else. Denver taught me that." Daniel's voice carried no triumph, only certainty. "Now, about those 50 men in the pass." But McGrath was already turning away, a strange smile on his face. "Drake's not going to like this," he said, mounting his horse. "Not one bit." "Tell him the valley's made its choice," Daniel called after him. "And tell him that next time I might not aim for the hat." As McGrath rode away, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, burning away the blood-red dawn. The watching crowd erupted in cheers, but Daniel barely heard them. His eyes were on his father, who stood straight and proud for the first time since Denver. The story of how a quiet young man had outshot the legendary Jack McGrath would spread far beyond Thunder Valley. But for Daniel Harrison, it was just one more problem solved with the physics his father had taught him. One more trajectory calculated to protect what mattered most. They say true talent reveals itself in the darkest moments, but what they don't tell you is what comes after. As the sun climbed high over Thunder Valley, Victor Drake himself emerged from the pass, leading his army of hired guns. But he wasn't riding into the trap he expected. He was walking into a legend already written. Word of McGrath's defeat had spread through his men like wildfire. The unbeatable gunman, outshot by a rancher's son who could calculate the path of a bullet in flight. Some called it impossible, others called it luck, but the doubt had been planted. If McGrath could fall, what chance did they have? Drake cut an imposing figure in his tailored suit and silver-trimmed saddle, every inch the successful businessman. But his eyes told a different story. The cold calculation of a man who'd built an empire on broken dreams and buried secrets. "Quite a performance," he called out, reining in where McGrath had stood earlier. "I didn't think there was a man alive who could outshoot Jack McGrath, especially not Thomas Harrison's boy." Daniel stood on his father's porch, exactly where this had all begun days ago. "It's over, Mr. Drake. McGrath was your best card and he just folded." "Over?" Drake's laugh was genuine. "Boy, look around you. I've got 50 guns at my back, enough money to buy every judge from here to Denver, and connections you couldn't. Imagine. You really think one lucky shot changes anything?" "Not one shot," Sheriff Wade stepped forward, holding up a stack of papers. "But these might. Telegrams from the territorial marshal, sworn statements about Denver, about the burned ranches, about every dirty deal and buried body. McGrath wasn't just your best gun. He was the only one who could tie it all together." Drake's confident smile faltered slightly. Accusations without proof, from desperate men trying to protect their worthless land. "Not worthless," Thomas Harrison's voice rang out strong and clear. "Rich in gold, according to your own geological surveys. The ones you had McGrath steal from the territorial office last year." He held up a familiar-looking document. "Amazing what a man keeps in his saddlebags, if you know when to look." The change in Drake was immediate and chilling. His hand dropped to an elegant derringer hidden in his vest. "You searched McGrath?" "Didn't have to," Daniel said quietly. "He left them behind. Seems a man's conscience can weigh heavy, even after years of carrying it." Drake's mask of civilization cracked, revealing the predator beneath. McGrath, he spat the name like poison. Should have known he'd turn soft eventually, just like your father did in Denver when he chose dirt over destiny. No, Daniel's voice carried across the yard. You never understood men like my father. Like McGrath, never understood that some things matter more than money, honor, legacy, the right to choose your own path. Choice? Drake's laugh was ugly. The only choice that matters is between power and weakness. I offered you wealth, offered you a future beyond this miserable valley. Instead, you choose to die defending dirt. His derringer came up fast, but Daniel was faster. The Colt seemed to materialize in his hand, its report sharp in the morning. Yeah, Drake's fancy gun went spinning away, along with any illusion of control he still maintained. That's the difference between us, Daniel said into the ringing silence. You see dirt, we see home. The next few moments would be debated in Thunder Valley for years to come. Some said Drake went for another gun. Others claimed he tried to give orders to his men, but everyone agreed on what happened next. Daniel's second shot took Drake's hat, a callback to Thompson and McGrath that wasn't lost on the watching gunman. His third shot split the silver concho on Drake's saddle, demonstrating a level of precision that defied explanation. 3 shots, Daniel announced calmly. Each one exactly where I wanted it. The next one goes where it needs to, Mr. Drake. Your choice. The empire builder sat frozen in his saddle, facing something his money couldn't buy and his influence couldn't corrupt. Absolute mathematical certainty. Behind him, his hired guns began to quietly withdraw, understanding that their employer's power was built on foundations as empty as his promises. The territorial marshal is riding in from Promise City, Sheriff Wade added into the silence, along with a federal judge and enough deputies to sort this mess out properly. Way I see it, you've got 2 options. Stay and face the music, or ride. Out now and never look back. Drake's face worked through a complex series of emotions before settling on a cold mask of hatred. This isn't over. Money talks louder than any marshal's badge. Maybe, Daniel agreed. But bullets talk louder than money. And I've still got 3 left in this gun, each one carrying a message you won't enjoy hearing. The choice, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. Drake wheeled his horse around, his army of hired guns parting to let him pass. As he rode away, the morning sun caught the silver on his saddle one last time, a final flash of false promise disappearing into history. One by one, his men followed, leaving only dust and memories behind. The defenders of Thunder Valley stood, silent, watching an empire crumble under the weight of a young man's calculated courage. Thomas Harrison turned to his son, pride warring with concern in his eyes. You knew, didn't you? Knew McGrath would choose honor over money in the end? Daniel nodded. Every man has a pattern, Pa, even the bad ones. McGrath's was built on reputation, on being the best. Once he understood he'd been beaten fair, his pride wouldn't let him keep riding for Drake. And Drake himself. His pattern was simpler, power over everything. Men like that, they can't handle being powerless. Can't face staying once their strength is broken. Daniel finally holstered his father's Colt. You taught me that too, even if you didn't know it. The gathered ranchers and townspeople began to disperse, heading home to spread the word that Thunder Valley was free. Sarah Connor's wagon rattled past, loaded with unused ammunition and untold possibilities. Martha Chen was already planning a celebration at her cafe. Frank Carter approached, extending his hand. Valley's going to need leadership going forward. Someone to help build something good out of all this. Got plenty of good people for that, Daniel deflected, shaking the offered hand. People who've earned the right to decide their own future. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel Harrison stood on his father's porch, just as he had when this story began. But the quiet young man who'd hidden his gift was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some talents couldn't stay buried forever. "What, now?" Thomas asked softly, standing beside his son. Daniel's smile was gentle but carried the certainty of well-placed lead. "Now, we do what Harrisons have always done, Pa. We protect what matters, help where we can, and make sure the next generation has the choice we almost lost." The morning wind carried the promise of change across Thunder Valley, whispering through grass that had witnessed an empire's fall and a legend's rise. They say true talent reveals itself in the darkest moments, but they forget to mention what that revelation costs and what it gives back in return. For Daniel Harrison, the price had been worth it. The quiet boy had become something more, not just a prodigy with a gun, but a symbol of what one person could accomplish when skill met purpose and courage found its target. The legend of Thunder Valley's defender would grow with time, but for now, there was a ranch to run, a father to care for, and a future to build. After all, some legacies aren't written in gun smoke and brass. They're measured in the lives they change and the choices they protect, and that's a story worth telling, no matter how many times it's told.